NASCAR just wrapped up perhaps its most important week of next-gen testing yet. We're going to look at the car in great detail. We'll discuss its strengths as well as its apparent weaknesses. How's it going, y'all? My name is Eric and welcome to Out of the Groove. There's been a lot of news this week. We're going to save a lot of it for tomorrow. Last night was the NASCAR Awards banquet. There's some unfortunate news about Eldora Speedway. Matt Kenseth talks about his racing future. We'll cover all of that and more likely in tomorrow's episode. But today, as I promised earlier this week, we're going to talk all about the next-gen car because now both days of testing are complete. On Monday, Kurt Busch and Martin Truex Jr. tested around the Charlotte Roval configuration. NASCAR spent most of Tuesday switching the cars over from road course to oval trim, and then yesterday, Wednesday, Truex and Kurt Busch took to the mile-and-a-half oval version of Charlotte Motor Speedway, and it was kind of a tale of two different tests. And I mean, even NASCAR admitted that one test was significantly better than the other. So we're going to talk all about what we saw in both tests, what the cars look like, the subtle differences between the road course setup and the cup or the oval setup. We'll talk a little bit about what Kurt Busch and Martin Truex Jr. had to say about the car. This was the first week of next-gen testing where we finally saw multiple next-gen cars on the track. In this case, we actually had two of them driving side by side next to each other yesterday. So there's a lot to react to here. I do feel like this was maybe the most important test yet. Obviously, the car is now very far along in development, but it's clear after yesterday's test, they still have some bugs to work out. So we're going to talk about that. But I want to start, we'll go chronologically. Let's start with Monday's road course or Charlotte Roval test. Now, the two cars that were being tested this week were built by two very different groups. The first car, that blue one, is basically the same prototype car we've seen at a number of these tests so far. It was built by Richard Childress Racing with help from NASCAR. The second car you'll see was actually one that tested at Homestead Miami Speedway a couple months ago. It was actually built by Jim France's Action Express Racing. That's an IMSA sports car team. They built their own next-gen car. Those were the two cars we saw testing this week. I would assume they were built to the exact same specifications, but that is the difference. Now, during and even after Monday's test on the Roval configuration, I noticed that both Kurt Busch and Martin Truex Jr. were willing to speak to the media quite a bit more. And in fact, Kurt Busch posted a couple different videos to social media of him basically showing the fans a bunch of the exciting details about the new car, or at least the things he was excited about.
But awesome feel with the car. The gearbox is so much fun. The sequential gearbox. The brakes, I want to show you guys the brakes are much bigger. 18-inch wheel with a center lug. Huge rear aero diffuser to help with rear stability. It's going to be great on the oval to feel that main difference of aero platform underneath the car. Try to make the top of the car less sensitive, so that way it's better in traffic.
On Monday, we heard a lot of talk about the new sequential shifter, which is of course going to come into play. It's mainly at road courses, and how much the drivers seem to like it quite a bit. Talking about the much bigger brakes on the car, which makes it easier to brake going into the corner. The two drivers compared the next gen on the road course to like Australian V8 supercars. They name dropped them a couple of times. Overall, reacting to their comments, it sounds like the car drove really well on the road course. And in fact, Kurt Busch put this tweet out at the end of the day saying, "We ended 3 seconds quicker than the Roval playoff race. Cars more efficient everywhere. Braking, cornering speed, and acceleration, even at 100 horsepower less than the race. So 650 horsepower. Fun to drive the sequential gearbox." So that is a very interesting detail, despite the cars this week having 100 less horsepower than the cars had in October for the playoff race, as he mentioned. Busch and Truex were turning laps that were multiple seconds faster than Chase Elliott's fastest lap in the fall race. That obviously implies that these new cars drive really nicely at road courses. It sounds like the drivers in this case, two veteran Champion Cup Series drivers, really enjoyed driving this car on the road course. So that Monday's test, honestly, I saw no flaws. I don't think there's really anything to be that troubled about watching Monday's Roval test. The drivers seemed to love it. NASCAR was not afraid to show fans every little detail on the car. They were really proud of what they put on the Roval Monday, so I'm confident. I think the road course version of this car is going to be fantastic. Martin Truex Jr. said in this post from Bob Pockrass that the car does everything a little bit better. He said the car turns really well, but he did add that they were having a little bit of trouble with the steering on the big track when the cars went out into the banking and went up to higher speeds. Some issues with the car bottoming out and the steering getting all wonky. That was the only concern Truex had, but he indicated then they would work on that on Wednesday when they primarily were racing around the big track. So genuinely, I have very few concerns about what we saw on the road course Monday. You could hear the sound of the engine, definitely a deeper growl is how I phrased it earlier this week. That's how it sounds to me. They have exhaust coming out of both sides, driver and passenger side, so that's different than the way it works now. I feel like some people aren't going to like the engine. Some people like the higher pitched engines of like the Gen 4 era. Some people like the deeper sounding, like I mean, the engine sound, let's be frank, isn't the most important thing about a car, but you want the engines to sound cool. You don't want it to sound like a wet fart, but you also don't want it to sound high pitched and like screechy or annoying. I don't think the next gen car crosses over into any of those territories. I think it's definitely deeper than the cars are now, but I like it. You know, I like a little deep rumble there. You know, that's cool. So looking at all the photos, looking at all the videos, listening to what the driver said, here are basically the highlights of the Roval version of the next gen car. And many of these do carry over to the oval version we'll talk about in a minute. The road course next gen car they tested Monday featured 650 horsepower. That's similar to what like the Xfinity series runs at most tracks these days. More horsepower than the Cup series currently runs at intermediate tracks. The next gen car has single lug nut, which we've seen before, 18-inch aluminum wheels. That's bigger than the wheels they run on the Gen 6. Dual exhaust, I mentioned that. The rear diffuser is back. I wasn't sure if we'd see the rear diffuser on the road course car. I figured we probably would, but I wasn't sure for sure. Hood vents, you could see those on the front of the car as well. Those look pretty cool. Larger brakes, Kurt Busch talked about those. I want to look at this photo right here. This photo was taken by Bozy Tatarevich on Twitter, and I saw a lot of people talking about this photo because you can really see, looking straight on at the car, how symmetrical the next gen car is. That was the big word being thrown around earlier this week. Compared to many recent generations of NASCAR Cup Series cars, this is different. This is a welcome sight to see. The car is not skewed out in any way, shape, or form to the right, it appears. This could definitely help limit the effects of side force on the race cars, especially at higher speeds. We'll talk about that more when we talk about the oval car, but interesting to see it on the road course car as well. So I just wanted to share that photo. That was exciting. That was an exciting thing to see on Monday. Other observations, the notch splitter is back in the front of the car. Should help somewhat with airflow getting underneath the car. Hopefully that's effective. Looking at the road course car, you can see the spoiler is there. It's not non-existent, but it does appear to be kind of a medium-sized spoiler. Certainly not as big as the spoilers we see on intermediates today with the Gen 6, but it doesn't look quite as short, perhaps, as what we see on road courses today. I haven't seen any like official measurements given, so it's hard to just eyeball it, but it looks medium-sized, a medium-sized spoiler, I guess. And then, of course, I haven't really seen any photos of it anywhere, but a lot of people are talking about the sequential gearbox, the H-pattern shifter that the drivers seem to really enjoy using on the road course, so that's also new to the next gen car. So I'll go and move on from the Monday test because I, again, didn't really see any glaring issues on the Monday test. Obviously, I'm not an engineer. I don't know what data. NASCAR has all the data behind the scenes. Maybe they saw something that they want to tweak. They probably did. I mean, we're still over a year from seeing the next gen car in race action, so plenty of time still to fine tune some things, but from, you know, the naked eye's perspective, from my perspective, hundreds of miles away, just seeing videos and clips on Twitter, the next gen car looks pretty exciting on road courses. And I would think some of that would carry over to short tracks as well, especially with like the bigger brakes and depending on the spoiler and the diffuser and all that other stuff. I'm sure this car is going to be a hit on short tracks as well, if I had to guess. We haven't really seen a short track test, though, in quite some time, so I don't want to make any promises that NASCAR can't keep, but I think the car is going to be good on road courses. I think it's going to be promising on short tracks as well, but let's be frank. The issue with the current rules package is not road courses and short tracks. Everyone wants to know how the next gen car is going to handle on the intermediate tracks, the 1.5 mile and bigger tracks, pretty much. So let's move over to Wednesday now, and Wednesday's test is a bit more troubling. It's clear NASCAR still has a lot of work to do, and NASCAR was actually willing to admit this immediately following the test. I saw this from Jeff Gluck from The Athletic, but he tweeted, NASCAR released some quotes tonight from John Probst, Senior VP of Racing Innovation, that indicated the drivers didn't like the oval setup of the next gen as much as the road course, but he said that wasn't anticipated. From John Probst, feedback today, frankly, wasn't as good as it was on the road course. We collected a significant amount of data from the last 3 days, and we'll start going through at 8 a.m. tomorrow morning at the R&D Center. We'll figure out what modifications we need to make. We'll enlist the help of our OEMs and teams to help us make the right decisions here as we finalize the design of this car in the next few months. So there you have NASCAR admitting that, okay, maybe the oval setup is not quite great yet. I mean, they have not been able to test the ovals much this year. They haven't really been able to test much at all this year with COVID restrictions and everything like that. So that's why partially the next gen car has been delayed to 2022 anyways. But it's a good thing at the end that he says they are not planning to finalize the next gen design for at least a few more months. So that's still a lot of time to make some tweaks because I mean, yeah, he admits it right there. The oval setup is not perfect, and the drivers did not seem to like it very much. So I just want to go down the list and talk about some of the things I observed, again, just watching videos on Twitter and for the most part. But the first thing I saw from Wednesday's test is the large spoiler is back, definitely larger than the spoiler they had on the car for the road course test. Again, I don't know any specific measurements. It's hard to eyeball it, but it looks roughly the same size as what we have at the intermediate tracks today with the Gen 6. So the big spoiler's there. It's still back. It's happening again. I mean, it's still just a prototype, but it's there. Now, this was interesting. There were a few people at the racetrack yesterday taking photos, taking videos, and early on in the day, there's some people like Christian Espinosa stationed up above turn 1, looking as the cars came down the front stretch and rocketed into the turns. And early on in the day, it sounded like there was a considerable amount of off-throttle time. You heard the drivers lift on entry, kind of like it was 2017 or 2018 again, and sounded like they stayed mostly off the throttle until at least the center of the corner when you could kind of hear them pick it back up and fire off the corner. It sounded at least like 2016, 2017, basically anything before 2019, I guess. But later in the day, after a number of tweaks, a number of adjustments, we heard the cars coming into turn 1. It did not sound like they were lifting too much. It sounded very similar to the current 550 horsepower package we have today. It's hard to judge listening from afar, obviously, listening through your phone. It's hard to completely judge, but it does not sound like the drivers were ever fully off the throttle, or if they were, it was for a half a second to 1 second or so. It was a very short amount of time, so closer to what we have today. So I know people are going to have different reactions to that. Third big observation I made yesterday is Martin Truex Jr. and Kurt Busch were a lot quieter. On Monday, you had NASCAR basically handing Kurt Busch the camera and saying, "Kurt, show everyone the car, talk about the car, like say everything you love about the car." And Kurt was like, "Heck yeah, we're doing it," posting videos left and right on his social media, on NASCAR social media. There was virtually none of that Wednesday, which makes me think perhaps NASCAR was either working really hard behind the scenes to adjust on things, or they were concerned Kurt Busch or Truex may say the wrong thing because the car wasn't quite to their liking. So that was, I mean, I don't mean to launch some conspiracy theory here and say NASCAR's trying to silence the drivers, but it's clear that this test was, in a lot of ways, a PR move. I mean, you look at NASCAR's social media, the way they treated the test the last couple of days was PR reasons. Like, look at how cool the car looks. I mean, it's PR. I mean, that's what NASCAR's do. They're protecting their brand. They're never going to actively try to discredit or discount their own brand, so I'm not faulting them. I'm just saying it feels like they muffled the drivers, or maybe the drivers just opted to muffle themselves because if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all. Maybe the drivers just took themselves out of the spotlight and were focused on really helping them fix the car behind the scenes. I have no idea, but I did find that interesting that the drivers seemed less talkative on Wednesday. Also, I mentioned Christian Espinosa, who literally lives at Charlotte Motor Speedway. I saw him put on Twitter that it seemed like there were fewer runs being made on Wednesday than Monday. There were a lot longer gaps between runs, which makes me think they were possibly taking a lot of big swings at the car or having a lot of things to debrief on, which makes it sound like this test did not go as smoothly as the Monday test. But, I mean, John Probst admitted that, so we know for sure now that this test wasn't as smooth. But those were the biggest observations I made. Now, we did see in this test 2 next-gen cars running side by side for the first time ever. And looking at some of the videos, and I'll show you one NASCAR release in a second, I can't take any of this that seriously. I mean, it's a test. There's no way in heck those guys were running 100% like they would during a real race. I mean, I'm sure they were giving it effort, and I don't want to say that they were just coasting around at caution speed. Obviously, they were giving it some effort, but I'm not going to put any real stock into seeing 2 cars side by side like this for a few seconds. Like, it doesn't mean anything. Maybe these cars are going to race tremendously next to each other. Maybe they won't. These videos that we saw yesterday, this test is not going to tell the fans any important information on that department. But you remember what I said earlier about off-throttle time? Here's a video NASCAR posted actually this morning, almost 24 hours after the test, showing Kurt Busch's in-car camera. There are a few things you can kind of react to watching this video. Firstly, you hear his throttle input quite clearly there. It sounds similar to the 550 horsepower package we run currently on intermediates, so I don't know, I obviously don't want full throttle Daytona racing everywhere, but for me, it's not so much about the on or off throttle time, it's about how big of a impact does dirty air have on the car? Obviously, if you're going 180, 190 miles an hour in a group, dirty air is always going to be a factor. It's always been that way. It's just physics. But if the new splitter, the new rear diffuser, the smoother symmetrical sides, getting rid of some of the side force, if all those at least help mitigate some of the effects of dirty air, you know, if the guys aren't lifting too much, I mean, you could see in that video, Kurt Busch was still fighting the wheel, at least with his arms, quite tremendously. His feet maybe weren't as busy, but his arms, his hands were extremely busy. You know, as long as you can run right behind or really close to someone in the corner, you know, I like off throttle time, sure, but it's not the most important thing to me. The most important thing is that you can actually race around people and you're not constantly running into invisible bubbles of dirty air, which is what we've seen a lot at intermediates the last 2 years. So, I mean, obviously I want more off throttle time as well, but you know, pick and choose your battles here. Now, as far as that like list I gave you for the road course car, the oval version of the next gen car has many of the same things, but there's a couple key differences. Firstly, I didn't see anyone say anywhere what horsepower they were running on the oval. Kurt Busch let it slip they were running roughly 650 on the road course. I did not see anywhere that said what horsepower they were actually running on the oval. Maybe it changed throughout the day. That could have been why we saw off throttle early in the day and then more full throttle later in the day. Maybe they were adjusting on horsepower throughout the test, but I didn't see anyone confirm anywhere what horsepower was being used when with the next gen car yesterday, so it's hard for me to say anything there. The other big difference is the spoiler, which I talked about already, but it was clearly a larger spoiler at the bigger track as opposed to the road course had the smaller spoiler. Creates drag, I mean, it's just the spoilers do what they do, adds downforce. I still don't fully understand what NASCAR's goal for the intermediate tracks is. What kind of racing do they want to see? Do they want to see 2014, where guys can get strung out, but there's still plenty of opportunities to pass and the cars slip and slide a little bit more? Is that what they want to see? Or do they actually want to see baby Daytona? Do they want to see 2 and 3 wide pack racing for an entire run, not just the first few laps? Like, is that what they want to see? Do they want to see what they saw in 2020? I would hope not. Or is there some sweet spot in there that we haven't seen yet that they're still trying to hit? I just don't entirely understand what NASCAR's actual goal is for the intermediates. It's clear they're not going back to 900 horsepower anytime soon, so that maybe limits some of their options, but I just can't tell what NASCAR actually wants with the intermediate package. Do they want it to look like a super speedway race? Just say if you do. I mean, I'll at least give you points for being honest with us, but I still don't understand exactly what NASCAR is hoping to accomplish with the intermediates. I think that's where a lot of the questions and the concerns still come into play, because I bet even the drivers testing the car today weren't always sure what to report back to NASCAR, because what does NASCAR actually want? What does NASCAR want the mile-and-a-half racing to look like? I don't know if the sweet spot they're trying to attain actually is attainable. Anyway, in conclusion, there are some things that I like about the next gen car so far, and there's some things that concern me about the next gen car. Things that I like: the symmetry of the car should hopefully make the car less sensitive to side force. I like the deeper sound of the engines, the growl, the dual exhaust. I like that. Like I mentioned earlier, the big brakes, the sequential shifter, the 650 horsepower. I think that's all going to be popular at road courses and hopefully short tracks as well. I also obviously like that this new car is going to cost less. I mean, times are tough, not just in NASCAR, but around a lot of other industries at the moment, and so cost-cutting measures are unfortunately necessary. But it does seem like NASCAR has been successful in cutting those costs. We see so many new teams trying to get into the NASCAR Cup Series today. That is good, so I like that about the car. And I also like, and it wasn't really talked about that much, but I like how quickly the cars were switched over from oval to road course set. I mean, they basically spent Tuesday doing it, but you know, the fact that they could take the exact same car and just switch them over. I mean, a lot of times the big teams especially have separate cars that only run road courses, cars that only run intermediates. It was kind of neat that in this case NASCAR is able to take the same exact car and switch it over, you know, overnight almost. That's pretty neat. And there's some other things I like overall, but those were the biggest things. There's definitely some concerns, and pretty much all my concerns have to do with the mile-and-a-half setup. Remember back in March before the pandemic, William Byron tested the car at Auto Club Speedway, and at the end of that test, he actually spun out and got into the wall. So I know what you guys are thinking, oh cool, the cars are hard to drive. I remember Byron's comments afterwards were a little concerning, because it sounded like the car, yes, was hard to drive, but not because, you know, you could feel it getting loose or it got loose really easily or something like that. It sounded like it was hard to drive more because the steering was just unpredictable. It was twitchy. And we heard Martin Truex Jr. say this week a similar thing about the way the steering and the handling works on the high banked, high speed parts of the track. So that is a little concerning. I do think there's some concern about the steering. It's a completely different mechanism in the next gen car than what the Gen 6 or recent iterations of NASCAR cars have run. And with the wheels being larger in circumference, different sides, you know, it's a lot to get used to, a lot to adjust on, so I am still a little concerned about that. I also am a little concerned about the horsepower. We knew they ran 650 on the road course, which I think is fine and good, but what are they going to run on the intermediates? I mean, if they run 650 on the intermediates, the NASCAR Xfinity Series proved in 2020 alone that you can have great racing with 650 horsepower. But I think there's a good chance that number is actually going to end up lower than 650. It'll likely end up in the 500 range if I had to guess. And if that's the case, all I'm really going to care about is that with the new engine package set to debut in 2 or 3 years, I would hope they build those engines directly to these parameters. Because the problem you really have now is NASCAR each week is running 900 horsepower engines. They put that tapered spacer, basically a restrictor plate on the engine to limit it to 550 or 750, whatever they want. And by choking that engine, the throttle response inevitably is going to be hurt by that. When drivers hit the throttle with the 550 package this year, the car takes a minute to get going, partially because you're choking that 900 horsepower engine down to 550. If NASCAR just builds 550 engines here in a couple of years, at the very least, when drivers hit the throttle, the cars might go a little bit more. I think that's what's most important, is the initial acceleration of the car when you hit the throttle. Top speed is top speed. You know, if the cars are going 195 or 205, I don't really care. It's about the throttle response, in my opinion. That's what I think is really going to make the racing better at intermediate tracks. So if NASCAR does end up going with 550, 600 horsepower, something like that, I mean, I think it'll be fine, but I'd really be looking forward then to the completely new engine package set to debut in 2023, which might have some other unforeseen bells and whistles as well, but I think that's really what everyone's going to be waiting for if NASCAR indeed goes the lower horsepower route. Because I think with the new engine, 2023, next gen car could put on fantastic intermediate racing regardless of horsepower. And my final concern has to do with downforce. I like what they're doing with the rear diffuser. I like what they're doing with the notch splitter. I've already talked about the sides of the car. Can all of that overcome the large rear spoiler on the back of the car? I think it very likely could. And given that the current next gen cars don't have any of those things, they just have the big spoiler, I do think all those changes will be for the better. So, and that, I guess I'm concerned, but I'm also excited about those changes. So it's somewhere in the middle, but I'm just concerned that NASCAR's going about downforce the right way. I think it's clear they're addressing the right things. I just hope it works. That's my concern, I guess. Anyway, gosh, yeah, we've talked all about the next gen car today. I'm no engineer. I think that's pretty clear if you're watching this video up to this point. I spent most of this video talking about the most notable differences, the most visual differences, you could say, about the next gen car compared to the Gen 6, but I understand underneath that exterior, there are a lot of things inside the next gen car that are completely different from the Gen 6 or the Gen 5 or the Gen 4 even. I try to focus in this video on the things that I think will have the largest impact on the racing product, but there's obviously much more to the next gen car than meets the eye. I don't really have enough time to talk about everything, for one, and I also personally just don't have enough knowledge. I'll just be honest. Again, I'm not an engineer. I just don't know enough about every single bell and whistle and how it's going to affect the racing to talk about all of that stuff, but I know there are a lot of great people on social media that you can listen to that know more about it than I do. So I'm just going to keep my reaction video there. Looking to the future of the next gen car, NASCAR said their next test is scheduled for December 15th and 16th. They'll test at Daytona, the Super Speedway oval configuration, I believe. NASCAR also said earlier this week that they hope to have manufacturer-bodied cars on the track by March of next year. So we'll get to see what the Toyota, the Ford, and the Chevy are going to look like sooner rather than later. So that is exciting. The next gen car is moving right along. I will say, after everything we've heard this week, perhaps it was a blessing in disguise that the next gen car had to be delayed to 2022, because think about it. If the car was debuting in 3 months as was originally scheduled, man, there's a lot of bugs perhaps to still be working on. I'm not convinced NASCAR was going to be able to fix everything to their liking in that amount of time. So as unfortunate as it is for a lot of people in the business were obviously banking on the next gen car being ready by 21. You know, for the long-term health of the sport and from a fan's perspective, at least, I think it is a blessing in disguise that NASCAR had to wait an extra year to work on this car and hopefully perfect it before we see it at Daytona in a year and a half. Anyway, y'all, that is all I've got for today's episode. Thank you all for watching. Let me know what excites you the most or has you the most concerned about the next gen car down in the comments below. Thank you all for watching. Subscribe if you are new to the channel. We talk NASCAR almost every single day, even during the off season. As you can see, the news is not slowing down and neither is Out of the Groove. As always, a tremendous thank you to my Patreon supporters as well. Plenty more to come this week leading into the weekend. I will see you all again very, very soon. Take care. Have a great rest of your day.